Welcome to another Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something you've been really curious about.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the origins of American government. We've got this awesome presentation called Origins of American Government to kind of guide us through it.
Oh, cool.
And I don't know about you, but I'm super excited to unpack these historical documents
Yeah.
and see how they shaped like the very foundation of a nation.
It's really interesting to trace those core principles, especially how they resonate even today.
Yeah, it's like we're holding a blueprint to a whole system of government. But where do we even begin with something this massive?
Well, you can't talk about American government without the Enlightenment. I
Huh.
mean, thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, huge influence on the founding fathers.
Oh, for sure.
They were the framework for a lot of the core principles, the ones we see in the U.S. government even now.
Yeah, those names ring a bell. Definitely from history class. But how did these European ideas become so central to America? Did they just like hop on a boat?
Well, take John Locke, for instance. He had this radical idea, at least back then, that everyone is born with certain rights. He called them natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Really resonated with the American colonists who felt like their rights were being, well, trampled by British rule.
Ah, so these weren't just theories. They were tied to the colonists' real lives.
Exactly. The colonists saw their struggles in those Enlightenment ideals.
Makes sense.
And Locke especially, huge impact on the Declaration of Independence. Remember that famous line? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
It's like ingrained in us.
Directly inspired by Locke.
Wow.
His philosophy was that government should be based on the consent of the people they govern, and they have the right to overthrow a government that violates their natural rights.
Pretty revolutionary for the 18th century, huh?
Oh, absolutely.
So Locke kind of plants those seeds of revolution, but what about those other thinkers? How did they shape things?
Well, Montesquieu, he was all about separating powers.
Right.
He said to prevent tyranny, you need to divide government power into different branches, each with their own jobs.
Sounds familiar. We've got the legislative branch making laws, the executive branch carrying them out, and the judicial branch interpreting them.
That's it. Checks and balances.
That whole system, though, wouldn't that make governing super slow?
Well, there's always a trade-off, right? Efficiency versus protection from tyranny.
Hmm.
Montesquieu thought a bit of inefficiency was worth it if it protected individual freedom and kept power from being concentrated in one place.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Gridlock's better than a dictator.
Exactly.
So I've got Locke for individual rights, Montesquieu for separating powers. Where does Rousseau fit in?
Rousseau was all about popular sovereignty, the idea that political power ultimately resides in the people. Government legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed.
Gotcha. Okay, so we got these big ideas floating around, but how did they actually take root in America?
You're right, we weren't just born with these principles. The groundwork was actually laid during British colonial rule. Ironic, isn't it? British policies accidentally led to their own downfall.
Interesting. How so?
Well, the colonists had experienced self-government through things like town meetings. They were used to having a say in their own affairs. Then Britain imposed all these taxes and regulations that the colonists saw as unfair and oppressive.
Right.
So that fueled a sense of being denied their basic rights.
So the more Britain tried to control, the more the colonists resisted.
Exactly. Unintended consequences. British policies designed to strengthen their control actually made the colonists want independence even more. Things like the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, those weren't just about taxes. They were about fundamental fairness and representation.
I can already sense that revolution coming.
Hmm.
It's amazing how those small acts of defiance turned into a fight for independence.
It really shows the power of ideas and the human desire for freedom.
Yeah.
The colonists were ready to risk it all. They took those Enlightenment ideals and made them their own, using them to justify breaking away from Britain.
Wow. Which brings us to the American Revolution, a period that defines this country.
Absolutely. A turning point in history. It showed that everyday people could challenge the system, fight for self-determination.
Talk about inspiring. But it wasn't just about winning a war. It was about building a new kind of nation, one based on liberty, equality, and governing themselves.
Right. It was a huge experiment, the whole world watching. They won the war, declared independence, but the real challenge was just starting. How do you actually build a government from nothing?
And from what I understand, their first try didn't quite work out.
You're thinking of the Articles of Confederation. It's often called the rough draft of the Constitution.
I see.
It had some serious problems.
Well, everyone makes mistakes. What went wrong with the Articles?
The biggest issue was a weak central government. It couldn't tax, couldn't regulate commerce effectively, couldn't even enforce its own laws. Imagine trying to run a country without collecting taxes or controlling trade.
Sounds chaotic.
Pretty much. States arguing a messed up economy and the sense that the nation was about to fall apart.
Yikes.
The articles just weren't working.
So they needed a do-over. Is that what led to the Constitutional Convention?
Exactly. They realized they needed a stronger national government, one that could provide stability and unity while still protecting individual freedoms and states' rights.
Okay.
So, in 1787, delegates from the states met in Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation.
What a moment in history.
Yeah.
This convention laid the groundwork for the government we have today?
It did, but it wasn't easy. You had representatives from different states, each with their own interests and priorities.
Oh, yeah.
Big debates about federal power, representation, and slavery.
It must have been like herding cats trying to get everyone on the same page.
It was a long process, lots of compromise and
What was
arguments.
that?
But finally, they came up with a new system. The United States Constitution.
The document that's guided this country for centuries.
Mm.
I bet not everyone loved it right away, though.
You're right. There was a lot of skepticism, especially about a strong central government.
Makes sense.
Many feared it would lead to tyranny, just like they had under British rule. And that's where the Federalist Papers come in.
Ah, yes. Those essays Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote to support the Constitution. Weren't they anonymous at first?
They were. They used the name Publius to avoid personal bias swaying public opinion.
Clever.
Really smart strategy. They could lay out their arguments logically without getting caught up in partisan politics.
So back then, going viral meant writing amazing essays and getting them in newspapers.
Exactly.
But what made these essays so effective? Why did they change people's minds?
The Federalist Papers did something incredible. They made the Constitution easy to understand, explaining its structure, its benefits, and why a stronger national government was necessary. They addressed those fears of tyranny, saying that the separation of powers and checks and balances would prevent any one person or group from having too much power.
Like the original explainer videos for the Constitution.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they're still important today. Anyone who wants to understand the Constitution reads the Federalist Papers.
Well,
They offer a look into the founders' intentions and the core ideas of American government.
we've covered a lot. Enlightenment philosophy, colonial struggles, a revolution, a failed government, and then the Constitution.
We have.
What a journey. Let's pause here for a sec to let it sink in.
Yeah, it's a lot.
But it's important to realize just how bold the founders were.
Absolutely.
They were creating a whole new system of government based on principles that were radical at the time. It's like they were building a ship while sailing it.
And with the whole world watching, the success or failure of this American experiment would impact not just them, but the future of democracy itself. Really makes you think about those debates and compromises.
Right.
And in the end, they created this document that shaped a nation for centuries.
It's incredible. Okay, so we've got this amazing document, this blueprint.
Yeah.
But what does it actually say? Like, what makes the Constitution work?
One of the key things is federalism,
Federalism.
dividing power between the national and state governments. It's a balance, making sure there's unity, but also local control.
Sounds tricky.
Hmm.
How do they make that balance work? What stops the federal government from just taking over the states, or the other way around?
That's where the separation of powers comes in,
Right.
like we talked about with Montesquieu.
Yeah.
The Constitution splits the federal government into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial.
Okay.
Each one has specific powers and responsibilities.
Right. Checks and balances. We touched on that earlier.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of how those checks and balances actually play out?
Sure. Imagine Congress passes a law, but the president thinks it's a bad law. He can veto it,
Oh, right.
so it doesn't become official.
I see.
But Congress can override that veto if they have enough votes, a 2/3 majority.
Okay.
And even if a law does go into effect, the Supreme Court can look at it and say, nope, this is unconstitutional, and basically get rid of it.
So it's like a constant back and forth to make sure no one branch has too much power.
That's the idea.
Makes you wonder, though, doesn't all this make governing really slow?
It can, definitely. But remember, the founders were more worried about tyranny than efficiency.
True.
They believed that a little gridlock was a small price to pay to protect individual liberty.
That makes sense. So they built in these safeguards to keep power in check.
Exactly. They wanted a system where power was spread out, not concentrated.
And it's not just those 3 branches checking each other.
Right.
It's also balancing power between the federal government and the states,
You got it. Multi-level balancing act.
with checks and balances at both federal and state levels.
Yep.
It's complex on purpose.
I see.
It's designed to make it hard for anyone to get too much power. So far, we've been talking about the structure of government.
Yeah.
But what about the people? Where do individual rights fit into all this?
That's where the Bill of Rights comes in.
Oh, right.
Do you remember John Locke's natural rights?
Yeah.
The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, spells out some of those basic freedoms that the government can't touch.
Right, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures.
Exactly.
It's amazing how we take those for granted.
It shows how deeply ingrained those rights have become in America.
For sure.
But it's important to remember they weren't always guaranteed. It took a lot of fighting to ensure those rights were protected for everyone.
No matter their race, gender, or religion.
Exactly.
It's almost like the Constitution itself is alive.
In a way, yes.
Evolving as our understanding of rights changes.
That's a great way to put it, and that's what the amendment process is for. The founders knew they couldn't predict everything.
True.
So they made a way to change the Constitution as society changes.
So they made a system that could adapt, just like the country.
Exactly. But amending the Constitution is really hard.
How so?
It takes supermajorities in both houses of Congress, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it.
Wow, so it's not just a simple majority vote.
No, it needs agreement across the country.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want to change something this important too easily.
Right, it has to be thought through carefully.
But the fact that it can be changed, that it's not set in stone, that's pretty amazing.
It is. It's one of the best things about it.
It means it can keep up with the times.
Exactly.
So we have this system of checks and balances, a focus on individual rights, and a way to adapt to change.
Yep.
But how well has this centuries-old document held up in the face of modern challenges?
That's the big question, isn't it? The world is so different from when the Constitution was written.
Yeah.
The ideas in it are constantly being tested and reinterpreted. But what's fascinating is that those core principles, even though they come from the 18th century, are surprisingly adaptable.
Really? Can you give me an example of that? Something the founders could never have imagined.
Well, think about the internet. It's totally changed how we communicate, how we get information, even how we participate in government.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also created new problems, like how do we have free speech but also prevent harmful things online?
Right. The founders couldn't have predicted social media or how to regulate online speech.
Exactly. And yet, the same principles they debated over centuries ago are still relevant today.
It's true.
The First Amendment says we have free speech, but how does that apply to a world where information can spread so fast and maybe even cause real harm?
I see what you mean. It's a tough one.
It is. It's like those principles are the base,
Okay.
but each generation has to figure out how to build on that base in a way that makes sense for their time.
That's a great way to put it. So they were all part of this ongoing process. And that's where you, the listener, come in. By understanding these core principles,
Exactly.
you can join these debates in a more informed way and help shape how they apply today.
I like that.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
It's not just history. It's about recognizing that the story is still going and we all have a role in the next chapter.
Absolutely.
But before we get too far ahead, let's come back to the present.
Okay.
What are some ways listeners can learn more about the Constitution and how it affects them today?
There are so many resources. The Federalist Papers, as we said, are full of insights.
Right.
Reading the Constitution itself can be helpful.
Okay.
Don't underestimate the power of just talking and debating with others.
It's important to have those conversations even when we don't agree.
Oh, absolutely. It's about challenging your own ideas, listening to others.
Yeah.
And, understanding the nuances of these issues. It's not about being right. It's about being curious and learning.
That's so true. So often these conversations about government and politics just become shouting matches. Everyone thinks they're right.
Yeah.
But you're talking about a more thoughtful approach, one that's open to different viewpoints.
Exactly. Democracy needs dialogue, a free exchange of ideas.
Right.
It's messy, it's not perfect, but it's the best way to make sure those in power answer to the people.
I love that idea. Democracy as a conversation, a constant give and take.
Yeah.
Makes you feel like we're part of something bigger, something we have a responsibility to participate in.
And that brings us back to the beginning, the origins of American government.
Okay.
The founders didn't just create a government, they created a system that needs active citizens.
They did?
They gave us the framework, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, but it's up to each generation to make those principles real, defend them, challenge them, and adapt them as things change.
It's like they built the stage, but we have to write the play, direct it, and keep the audience engaged.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It is, but it's also empowering. It means we have a voice. We can shape our nation. We're not just watching government happen. We're part of it.
This deep dive has been amazing. I understand American government so much better now.
Good.
How it works, how it's changed, and how we can all be part of its future.
That's great to hear. And this is just the start. There's always more to learn.
Sure.
The story of American government is still being written, and you're part of it.
And that's a perfect place to stop. Thanks for joining us today as we explore the roots of American government. We hope you learned something and maybe gained a new appreciation for the ideas that still guide this nation.
It's been great being here. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those conversations going.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.